Now, we can't talk about the progressives without really building on the populists who had introduced a number of reforms, particularly for the little guy, the farmers, against the man, industrialists. But in many ways, the progressives are building on populist ideas, but really trying to solve problems created by industrialism, particularly created by industrialism in the cities. So you get many of the reformers in the progressive era who are motivated by religion, particularly Protestantism. So Christian moralists who looked not only at industry, but also looked at politics and said city politics and state politics had really become a contest between good and evil and honesty and corruption. And you had all of these corrupt politicians that were taking money from industrialists and that didn't care about the little guy. Now, these progressive reformers shared an assumption that government, be it local, again, that's sort of city, state, or federal, must take a more active role in addressing the problems created by rapid urban and industrial growth. Now, that's interesting. They're saying government is the solution. However, government itself, they thought, was also corrupt. So they needed to clean up government in order to use government to clean up society. And in many ways, they wanted to make government more responsive and efficient and make businesses more honest and safe. And so they used emerging social sciences, the kind of stuff we study today, but was actually pretty new in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So sociology, political science, psychology, public health, economics. These ideas were being developed and practiced at research universities really for the first time. And progressives wanted to enable experts, namely people who studied these disciplines, to investigate, educate, and legislate. So they really were looking for people with social scientific expertise to try to recommend and enact changes that could clean up government so that government could be used to clean up society. Their main assumption was, if people know the truth, okay, they will act upon it. And that's a very important idea. If we can sort of bring these ideas to the masses, smart people will actually create change. Now, it's important to understand that we had populism in the late 1800s. Again, we sort of saw the Grange moving into the populist party in certainly 1892 and 1896, but it really was a Southern and Midwestern phenomenon. Progressivism was much bigger. It wasn't just regional. It was a national movement, really centered in large cities, but it also had some support in rural areas. These people became known as populist progressives. And no one party seemed to have a monopoly, no pun intended, on being progressives. Progressives came from the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Populist Party, even socialists. Labor unions were progressive, and even some business executives were considered progressive. Men and women, white and black, there really was it was a general feeling about needing to clean up society. Now, there certainly were inconsistencies and hypocrisies that we're going to see within progressivism, and there's no way to sort of get around it. Many of these men and women, and really, like we saw in the antebellum reform era, really a strong emphasis on women's involvement, they were motivated by Christian moralism. Yet at the same time, this whole worldview that they had was also limited by racial and ethnic prejudice, and oftentimes by social and intellectual snobbery. So they tended to be white, upper middle class Christians who were well educated. Now, they rarely advocated for racial change. It wasn't something that they saw as important. Now, there are leaders like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and we tend to look at them as sort of the most famous political progressives because they occupied the White House. We won't forget Taft. We'll talk about him a little bit. But these guys particularly believed in the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon race. We certainly know that about Teddy Roosevelt relative to his, expansionist tendencies in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they looked at, the Anglo-Saxon race, and they looked at their own upbringing and relative to the working poor, and they generally assumed in a very patronizing way that, modern society and the problems of modern society were too complicated for the uninformed masses to understand or improve society without direction from wiser, richer people. And in some ways, that really echoes what we saw with Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. There is a need to help, but at the end of the day, the help needs to come from those who know how, those who have been successful. Now, we've got to think about the context of why this is all happening in the late 1890s. We have our Panic of 1893, which is the last of the 19th century panics, 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893. And as a result, you have about an eighth, about 12% of all Americans, 10 million out of 82 million, are living in poverty. And upper middle class urban people, again, people living in cities, these are much more of your white collar people, your doctors, lawyers, executives, even social workers and teachers and professors and journalists, all of them college educated. And then college educated women, some of whom weren't working, they looked around and they said, you know what, we need to organize efforts to reform society. But it's important that you realize that this wasn't just a totally benevolent, magnanimous gesture of wanting to help the little guy. They looked at the situation and they said, we want to keep poor people from becoming revolutionaries. Certainly something that is drawing on experiences that you've seen in Europe in the 1800s. Got to watch out for the poor people. They could overthrow the system. Now, you're going to have a group of journalists that were known as muckrakers. And these were your investigative journalists who really looked at their purpose as informing the public about political corruption and social problems. And so their goal through magazines like McClure's magazine and Cosmopolitan magazine, these journalists were trying to educate the upper and middle classes about political and corporate wrongdoing. So they really saw the evils as coming in government and in business. And they also wanted to show, quote unquote, how the other half lives. Now, there was a Danish photographer named Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, who used pictures and stories to show people who'd never been to the slums what it was like to live in these tenement houses and on the dirty, grimy streets, particularly of New York, really to show you this is what you're not seeing, this is what you need to see, and this is what needs to be changed. Now, these muckrakers really gave journalism more of a political role. Now, that being said, they didn't necessarily see themselves as people who were going to make the changes themselves. They weren't politicians, but they were going to bring this to the attention of politicians who were supposed to create change. You still got one problem. These politicians, many of them, were corrupt, so you had to clean up government. Now, we have this idea of the social gospel. Please do not confuse it with the gospel of wealth, despite the fact that in both cases there was an idea of helping poor people. However, the gospel of wealth by Carnegie was really this much more patronizing, like the rich need to help the poor because the poor can't help themselves. But the social gospel was the Protestant belief that Christians should help the poor to bring about this kingdom of God on earth. And really this was the idea of what would Jesus do? Would Jesus leave these poor people in the cities to suffer? No. So you have ministers like a guy named Washington Gladden or Walter Rauschenbusch who saw the end of individualism. They saw the Gilded Age as a time where people were just trying cutthroat competition to get to the top. But instead now they said this is a time of social responsibility where we have to come together. And so what you have was ministers in the cities who said, Christianity has become too closely associated with the upper crust of society, and it's really lost its appeal to the working poor. So this is actually before the Progressive era had even started. This is right in the heart of the Gilded Age in 1875, where a guy named Washington Gladden said, true Christianity is based on the idea from Christ that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, and that the poor didn't deserve this fate. And they should be helped. So this whole idea of social Darwinism, just sort of letting people suffer because they're poor, went out the window. So it was an unpopular view at the time, but he explicitly supported the rights of workers to unionize, and he spoke out against racial segregation and efforts to discriminate against immigrants. So at this time in the Gilded Age, when people were anti-unions, they were, anti-black people, and they were anti-immigrant, he was actually doing the opposite. And Walter Rauschenbusch, who came after him, sought to expose the realities of poverty in America and really to call on government to deal with the crisis. So not an unusual idea for the progressives, but these are specific ministers that are involved. Now, Gladden and Rauschenbusch really sought to expand this kingdom of God, again, by following Christ's example. Again, asking themselves, what would Jesus do in terms of serving the poor and the powerless? And in their mind, as I said earlier, they understood that rugged individualism, which might have helped people get wealthy, wasn't the answer. In their mind, something called Christian socialism was. And they would offer hope for unity among the classes. And they saw the progressive era as a time for social solidarity to resolve the economic problems that had arisen during the Gilded Age. Now, one very important person that comes on the scene and is certainly religiously motivated is Jane Addams, and working here in Chicago, considered at one point the most famous woman in the world. Now, Jane Addams and another woman who doesn't get as much credit, Ellen Gates Starr, were both upper middle class educated women. And then upper middle class educated women really didn't have many opportunities in the late 1800s. And so this became a problem for Jane Addams. She had, traveled throughout Europe, particularly in London, had seen their slums, and had seen the settlement house called Toynbee Hall in the slums of London, and had seen how this particular settlement house had really helped the working poor move their way up the rungs of the ladder in society. And she came back and she bought Hull House, and her goal was to address the needs of the working poor, particularly newly arrived European immigrants to Chicago. And this is a woman who moved down into the city, into the poorest neighborhoods, which actually at the time, or where UIC is located now, University of Illinois Chicago, and she wanted to share the lives of the poor and make social service express the spirit of Christ. So again, religiously motivated. She and about 25 other women served thousands of people every week at Hull House. They had a ton of services. They had a nursery for infant children whose moms were working. They sponsored health clinics. They had lectures, some very enlightening, academic lectures. They had music lessons. They had an art studio. They had men's clubs, an employment bureau where you could try to find jobs and you could get job training. They even had a gym, a coffee house, and a savings bank. And now, what's important is they were offering all of these services to help people survive and work their way up. Okay, you have these skills, you can now get a better job. Hopefully you can even get a better place to live. Now, Jane Addams looked at the situation and said, we can do all this. Effectively we're doing social work. She is considered really the pioneer in social work. But she said, I can't just be a social worker. I need to be more involved in politics. So she actually began lobbying for new laws and regulations to improve the living conditions in poor neighborhoods. It wasn't enough to say, I'm going to help you get skills. I need to actually improve the situation. She believed that the environment was, in fact, the problem. And she was appointed to government and community boards that were focused on improving public health and food safety. And, it might seem like not a big deal, but she wanted better street lighting, and she wanted police protection in poor neighborhoods. She was anti-drugs that were emerging at the time. She also got appointed the city's first garbage collector, and she actually went all around emptying garbage bins. She was truly a woman dedicated to improving the conditions of the people and also the conditions that they lived. She also was a very vocal suffragette, and later the first American woman very deserving to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Now we're going to transition now to suffrage. Now, of course, we know that all men got suffrage in the 15th Amendment right after the Civil War, basically, and that many women activists felt very betrayed by the fact that black men got to have suffrage, but women didn't, particularly when they had worked together for so long in the antebellum reform effort. So we want to look at sort of, what is the condition of women at the time that we're talking about. So employed women had gone from 2.6 million in 1880 to almost 8 million in 1910. So you have, again, almost 3 times as many women that are employed. And you start to have a ton more college-educated women. So actually, women's colleges had really come of age even before the Civil War and became much more popular after the Civil War. Now, many men looked at, college-educated women, looked at women calling for the vote and said, you know what? That's cute, but you should really stay out of politics because women are morally pure and politics is not, so stay out. Now, Wyoming became the first territory to give women suffrage. Not surprising, I mentioned this before. Women tended to have more power out west, in part because they were doing such hard work. And it's important to realize that when Wyoming became that first territory in 1869, the movement splits, and we're going to talk much more about that in the next lecture about what the focus should be for women's suffrage. Should you just focus on getting the right to vote, or having a broader agenda. In some ways, it's almost the idea of like the Knights of Labor, broad agenda versus much more holy trinity of labor like the AFL.